Thank you for joining us today at the Century Club of Scranton. In case you didn't know it, this is the site for just about every important women's initiative that took place in Scranton in the early 20th century. So you're in the place where it happened. In fact, in this room is where discussion of suffrage and meeting of suffrage took place. So if these walls could talk, we'd have a great story here today. What I'd like to do before I actually begin to talk about the women of our area, I'd like to thank the two groups that have really made all of my research possible. One of them is the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, that I serve as a Commonwealth speaker, and the other is the Pennsylvania Commission for Women. Now, I think you would probably agree with me that both organizations have been essential players in supporting our study of the history of Pennsylvania. And quite tragically, the Pennsylvania Commission for Women no longer exists. It was founded in 1974 by our governor, our native son, William Warren Scranton, and it has fallen victim to the budget cuts that are being, well, happening in Harrisburg. So this is now the time more than ever to support our own Lackawanna Commission on Women. What I'd like to do today is talk about the women of northeastern Pennsylvania. They played significant but largely unsung roles in Pennsylvania history. And their women are unsung not because what they did was unimportant, but because no one has considered their lives as the history of Pennsylvania. No one has asked in the state's anthracite and rural Northeast, while men were working, building industry, establishing banks, and promoting commerce, what were their wives, daughters, and sisters doing to build the growing city? I imagine this question could be raised in other regions of Pennsylvania, but not in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. If you pick up any compendium on Pennsylvania women, you will see that Philadelphia is well represented. But in other parts of the state, how many lives and deeds of women have remained in plain sight but been ignored as significant pieces in the many-colored quilt of our state's history? Why is that? When I began research of women's history in Scranton 5 years ago, I found much information on predictable topics. The textile industry, strikes, poor labor conditions, labor unions. The coal industry, strikes, child labor, John Mitchell, and labor unions. Immigration, industrialization, sweatshops, Americanization, labor unions. There was no lack of study on the industrial history of northeastern Pennsylvania, and this is an important topic in the history of our region. I respect the history of anthracite coal mining in the Wyoming and Lackawanna valleys. It's the true hard foundation upon which the lives of most of today's families stand. It's the foundation built in the pursuit of the American dream. So I honor the women who kept their large families together, burying brothers, fathers, husbands, and sons along the way. These women are everyday heroines in every sense of the word. But other classes of women played a role in the history of northeastern Pennsylvania, and their story has not been told. Most belong to the upper and rising middle class and to a second generation of immigrant family. Most of them gave freely of their money and their time to improve health care, raise educational standards, lobby for child labor reform, and march for women's suffrage. No one coerced them into doing these things. These are the women I will be introducing this evening. I hope that at the end of the presentation, you will be inspired to realize that regional Pennsylvania history has no need to apologize for itself as something less than national history, or less than the comparatively better known histories of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. National history plays out on the smaller stage of American cities, from the Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico to San Francisco Bay. And if at the end of this presentation we are wondering how many other aspects of regional Pennsylvania history have not been studied, well then this discourse will have served its purpose. So let's begin with Scranton's celebrated woman who lives still in popular myth and legend. How could I not commence with Phoebe Snow of Steamtown, USA? Phoebe was quite the fictional lady, created in the minds of the advertising department of the Lackawanna Railroad. Always dressed in white, she was setting off from Buffalo, New York, on a voyage to distant cities. Poetry, as you can see, traveled with her in these advertisements, and the sing-song rhymes never failed to observe that this modern 20th century woman never exited a train covered in coal dust, because she traveled with a railroad company that used clean-burning anthracite coal. You see one of the verses on the screen. Here's yet another one. They all have a kind of similarity. A cozy seat, a dainty treat, makes Phoebe's happiness complete, with linen white and silver bright upon the road of anthracite. All right. All right. All well and fine for promoting the coal industry and the railroad. But what does Phoebe Snow represent for women, besides the fact that they can travel in white on the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railway? Is it all about clothes? Think for a moment. The success of these advertisements depended on how truthful they were, how effective they would be to young 20th century women reading them. Next. If we look at the advertisement from this angle, here's what we see. A young woman traveling alone on the train. She's leaving the protection of her family, taking a public transport system alone, and arriving in another city where she will be obliged to depend upon the kindness of strangers. Phoebe is, in fact, the new American woman of the 1900s, 1920. She's independent, interested in the world beyond her front door, and dauntless in her efforts to forge a life of her own. The advertisement would not have made much sense to women otherwise. Travel, ladies, because you want to and because you can. Now, Phoebe Snow is a fictional lady. She was intended to promote travel on a railroad that at that time hired few women. And although Phoebe died young as a casualty of the anthracite industry during World War I, she's an excellent woman with whom to begin this presentation in light of the fact that one young lady of Scranton, age 16, begged her father to allow her to take the train alone to Harrisburg to picket for women's suffrage. Her father, Judge Warren, said yes. Many fathers would not have said yes in 1900. And this is how young Marion Marjorie Warren Scranton began her lifetime career as a political activist. Marjorie Scranton's political career, so auspiciously begun, did not falter with marriage to local businessman Worthington Scranton, son of one of Scranton's founding families. Before the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, Marjorie drove her automobile throughout the state, stumping for suffrage. She was one of an 8-car brigade of women. They were known as the Flying Squadron. All 8 cars driven by women on a mission. After the 19th Amendment had passed, Marjorie exchanged bipartisan women's activism for partisan and was elected Lackawanna County's first Republican county chairwoman. In time, she became a state representative committee member and treasurer of the Pennsylvania Council of Republican Women. In 1928, she was elected National Committee Woman from Pennsylvania, a post she retained, 1928, through 1951. Her commitment to the Commonwealth was recognized in 1953 when she was declared a Distinguished Daughter of the Commonwealth. Marjorie died in the year 1960, the very year her only son, William Warren, was inaugurated as Pennsylvania's 38th governor. Marjorie's place in regional and state history is indisputably important to the story of women's suffrage, women in child labor reform, and emerging women in Pennsylvania politics after 1920. But there's no book written about her. No scholarly or popular journal has been published an essay on her life. Before she died, she destroyed all of her documents, which makes researching her life through primary documents impossible. I work largely with secondary documents through oral history interviews, memorabilia left by her friends and colleagues, memorabilia in the form, for example, of letters that exist throughout the United States in various archives. And slowly, Marjorie is beginning to reveal herself. I hope that she will be well known to the next generation of Pennsylvania's political women. But why has she been lost to history? What is this? Marjorie's benefaction to the women of Pennsylvania is large, but she also left a long-lasting gift to the city of Scranton, the Scranton Area Foundation, that continues to support local, charitable, educational, and public service-oriented projects and organizations. Marjorie Scranton knew this woman, whose life of service to the causes of women was intertwined with hers, Kate Ryan Chapman. I caution you, do not let her benign, grandmotherly appearance deceive you. She was a one-woman hurricane, a powerful voice for women's suffrage in Lackawanna County. Women in Scranton today know nothing about her. Does anyone here know? No. Not only should we know her, but every woman in Pennsylvania should know her. And here is her story. In 1910, the Scranton Times reported, quote, "If there are any suffragettes in Scranton, they are very slow to express themselves." Well, that was 1910. By 1913, Kate Chapman had single-handedly turned the Scranton suffrage story around. She founded the Lackawanna County Equal Franchise League on January 13, 1913, and she began the local campaign for the franchise. She was affiliated with the National Association of National American Women's Suffrage Association, and quickly became the nucleus for all suffrage activities in northeastern Pennsylvania. 12 members in 1913. 1 year later, she had 4,690. She was a hurricane. One of Kate's activist strategies was street speaking to advocate suffrage. Her first attempt to organize speakers was not very successful. No woman could be found who would make a real 30-minute speech. Eventually, she succeeded in prevailing upon 4 women, each of whom were persuaded to speak for 5 minutes each. And Kate boasted later, now this added up to a good-sized suffrage speech. By 1915, fear of speaking in the public domain before audiences of unknown political persuasion was absolutely overcome, and women of Scranton were speaking throughout the city at rallies, in churches, and movie theaters. Next. But here is Kate Chapman's greatest gift to the women of Pennsylvania. In 1913, mark this year, in 1913, the Pennsylvania Senate was voting on a bill authorizing an amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote. 3 times, the vote resulted in a tie. 3 times the lieutenant governor broke that tie, thereby postponing a final vote. Lackawanna County Senator Walter McNichols vehemently declared his anti-suffrage stance at this time and his intention to vote the bill down because, as he said, that is not what Lackawanna County wanted. Well, that was all Kate Chapman needed to hear. In record time, she circulated a petition that garnered 1,000 votes, obtained the endorsement of the Central Labor Union, representing 70,000 workers in northeastern Pennsylvania. She made her way to Harrisburg, placed both documents in Senator McNichols' hands, and personally delivered to him the voice of Lackawanna County. Well, McNichols changed his vote from nay to aye, breaking the tie, but not without a fight. He stated, "Personally, I'm against this movement. I've been outspoken against it in my home city. I'm forced to vote for the bill. I'm sorry I have to, but I'm forced under the circumstances. I do so under protest, and I shall work against women's suffrage when the question is put to the people, for I believe it is wrong in principle." Well, thank God for Kate Chapman. Kate Chapman's singular role in swinging the suffrage vote in Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania Senate, led to her election as vice president of the Pennsylvania Woman Suffrage Association and the selection of Scranton as the site for the association's annual convention in 1914. Women throughout the state gathered in Scranton's Hotel Casey to plan suffrage strategy for 1915. Kate Chapman presided at what came to be called the campaign convention and inspired delegates at the rally with this statement: "We must organize, agitate, and educate if we hope to win." With passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, Kate Chapman's activism didn't cease. She co-founded the Women's League for Political Education before August 1919 and instructed in civic rights and responsibilities for women throughout Lackawanna County. Most students in Pennsylvania, I would bet, learn of the suffrage story at the national level, Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt, and this history can seem almost too grand for us rural counties. But knowing the suffrage story in Scranton and northeastern Pennsylvania demonstrates the pivotal role women in small towns can play for state and ultimately national history. But Chapman, too, has been lost. Why is this? Both Marjorie Scranton and Kate Chapman knew this very small lady whose life of big service to the causes of women was intertwined with theirs. I think she's probably my most favorite Lackawanna woman so far. This is Dr. Anna Callista Clark, homeopathic physician and suffragist. From the moment she arrived in Scranton from Athens, Pennsylvania in 1893, Anna Clark's life revolved around women's issues, from health to education to politics. When Chapman was organizing the Equal Franchise League in 1913, Anna Clark was right there beside her. She was the co-founder. Clark led a group of young women suffragists who soon became known as the Flying Squadron of Street Orators. She became one of Kate Chapman's itinerant instructors in the Women's League for Political Education, traveling between Carbondale and Wilkes-Barre, no mean feat in those days, educating and conducting 8-week seminars for women in American citizenship. 6 years after women received the right to vote, Dr. Clark founded the Lackawanna County League of Women Voters, which exists today in its 3rd foundation of the 1970s. If you ask anyone today in the current league who the founder was, they don't know that it was Anna Clark in 1926. There's no sense of there having been a women's movement before 1970 in northeastern Pennsylvania. Why is this? With Chapman, Clark wrote for the Searchlight, the voice of Lackawanna County Republican women in the early 1920s. Partisanship issues aside, what made this group of women singular in Republican Party politics at the time was their refusal to toe the party line. They voted on the merits of individual candidates. And while this practice led to a very crippling, very acrimonious split between the Republican women in the early days, Chapman and Clark continued to espouse the nonpartisan goals of their suffragist days. Dr. Clark was also involved with founding Scranton's homeopathic hospital, Hahnemann, today the Community Medical Center. Hahnemann Hospital was designed after the German physician who founded this branch of medical practice, homeopathy. I assure you that it is not widely known in Scranton that a group of 15 women founded Hahnemann Hospital in 1899, nor that an all-woman board of managers ran it through the 1920s. Dr. Clark was a consultant to the board. She was a graduate of the University of Michigan's Medical School and one of a significant number of women physicians in Scranton. Most of her colleagues, however, were graduates of the Philadelphia College of Medicine, founded in 1850. One of these, her fellow physicians, was a woman named Gisela von Postwick, who became a nationally recognized expert in radiology. Dr. Postwick's scrapbooks from her student days are preserved in the Philadelphia College of Medicine archives. Maybe we can go there and find out what this young doctor who worked in Scranton did as a medical student in Philadelphia. But to date, I'm sorry to say, I have discovered absolutely no primary documents belonging to Dr. Clark or Kate Chapman in Lackawanna County. I have had to construct their lives basically from newspapers. Why is this? How did they come to be lost? Dr. Clark also belonged to a local women's organization called the College Club, founded in 1905. Initially, the club was established by college-educated women to afford opportunities for meeting and raising funds to send needy girls to college. It wasn't long before one of its co-founders, Carolyn Patterson, realized that the club could serve a higher purpose by aiding Scranton's working mothers. With Dr. Clark, she advocated creation of the city's first day nursery, looking to Chicago Settlement House activist and sociologist George Zuplin for advice. While Dr. Clark interviewed working mothers with children to enroll and oversaw the health of all, Patterson and other college club women rented a house, acquired donated furniture and toys, hired a daily nurse, obtained donations of food or prepared food themselves, and opened the nursery doors in October 1910. What I'm showing you now on the screen is a cartoon that is poking fun at the women's club movement. And the cartoon shows a young girl who has entered a women's club, and obviously she's standing before a woman who is very much at her ease. And in the door, outside to the right there, you see her husband holding a babe in arms with two children next to him. And what the young girl is saying to the reclining, relaxing lady is, "Your husband wants to see you, Mom. He says the baby's tooth is through at last, and he has come to show it to you, Mom." The fear, of course, was that women would become so active in women's club work that they would forget their husbands, their homes, and their family. Next. What's very interesting about the College Club of Scranton is that it, too, still exists. It exists today as the local chapter of the American Association of University Women. Why do we not know our roots? What a tremendous realization to realize that the College Club still exists and basically does what it was intended to do since 1905. The women's club movement of the early 20th century has been studied in many cities and states throughout America, but no one has studied the movement here in northeastern Pennsylvania. This is rather interesting since of the two women's clubs that founded the State Federation of Women's Clubs in 1895, one was in northern Pennsylvania. The other, of course, not surprisingly, was in Philadelphia, the New Century Club. But it was the Women's Club of Bradford, city, not county, that joined the Philadelphia Club in establishing a statewide network of women's clubs that united their voice and purpose, successfully lobbied for women's issues at municipal, state, and federal levels. I don't think many in Pennsylvania, let alone in our region itself, know what a seed bed of feminism was thriving in northeastern Pennsylvania. Did you know that? I didn't. Particularly in Bradford County, in Athens. Once the State Federation of Women's Clubs was founded, the fastest growth in women's club work took place in Bradford County in Towanda. And Wyalusing and Honesdale were not far behind. In Athens, Women's Club member Louise Wells Murray is a good example of industrious club women of northeastern Pennsylvania. It's a fact that our knowledge of Pennsylvania's Native American heritage would be much the poorer without the lifetime work of Louise Murray and her counterpart in Luzerne County, Frances Dorrance. Both were active in the formation of the state's Professional Archaeological Society. Both were founders of institutions that continue today to preserve and educate on Paleo-American culture and artifacts. In Athens, Wells College graduate Louise Murray co-founded the Tioga Point Museum in 1895 and administered it as the first director. How many here have been to the Tioga Point Museum? Oh, we'll have to schedule a bus trip. The museum, little visited and poorly studied for the role it played in Athens' cultural life, remarkably has been directed by women since its founding, all women, including Louise Murray's two daughters, Elsie and Jessie. Louise's interest in local history was whetted when her cousin, the archaeologist Raphael Pumpelly, spent a winter in Athens rewriting his field notes. Excavations in her backyard in 1882 revealed the remains of an Indian burial ground. Louise's career was off and running. Ultimately, she became a charter member of the Society for Pennsylvania Archaeology. She was a frequent contributor to the journal American Anthropologist. She authored a book, Old Tioga Point and Athens, and a story, the history of the historical site of French Asylum. Both of these books are still considered primary sources in study of northeastern Pennsylvania. Now, in Louise Murray's case, I'm fortunate because she left much of her memorabilia at the Tioga Point Museum, where I studied the history of the women's club movement through her records and in Bradford County. Louise's life has been in plain sight, but she's been lost too. Why is this? Louise's friend Frances Dorrance, Phi Beta Kappa Vassar, 1900, of Wilkes-Barre, is a rather extraordinary person, passionately devoted to local history in Luzerne County. In 1924, on her own initiative, no one told her to do this, on her own initiative, Frances conducted a survey of Paleo-American sites in eastern Pennsylvania. Guess how many she located? Give me a number. 100? 1,900. And for this extraordinary work, she was appointed to the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission in 1929. She held the position through 1955, and the Wilkes-Barre chapter of the Society of Archaeologists proudly bears her name. She knew Louise Murray and served as the first secretary of the Pennsylvania Society of Archaeologists. But unlike Louise Murray, Frances Dorrance's records are few. None are preserved in the Luzerne County Historical Society, while some, fewer than I thought, are held in the state archives in Harrisburg. They would be there by virtue of the position that she held. I have a few more leads to follow, but they don't entail contacting descendants. Both she and her sister never married, a state of blessedness shared by Anna Clark as well. The property of unmarried women from this era can be lost or it can be anywhere. What Frances left as her bequest, however, is an extraordinarily fine collection of Native American artifacts in Wilkes-Barre, now exhibited in the museum attached to the Luzerne County Historical Society. Among the artifacts there are items related to Frances Slocum, a young pioneer girl who was thrust unwillingly onto the stage of regional history in the Wyoming Valley. Frances was born in New England, of a New England family that settled in the historic Wyoming Valley. The Wyoming Massacre of 1778 saw her capture by Native Americans and her adoption into the Delaware tribe. Given the name of Makanakwa, she was twice married and bore 4 children before becoming a tribal matriarch in 1837. In that year, she was finally reunited with the Slocum family, who had traced her whereabouts to Indiana. Fully acclimated to her Native American way of life, Frances didn't return to the home and customs of her American childhood. In the Historical Museum of Wilkes-Barre, there are personal items and clothing that belonged to Frances. There's also a portrait there of her by Wayne County artist Jenny Brownscombe, who made a name for herself far beyond the Pennsylvania borders, at a time when it was still difficult to do so. Jenny studied art and supported herself as an artist in early 20th century America. Most well-known of her works is the First Thanksgiving in the collection of the Plymouth Historical Society in Massachusetts. It's reproduced throughout America during the month of November, sort of as a visualization of the first Thanksgiving, but few know or could easily determine by careful study of her paintings that her work, Brownscombe's work, depended on accurate study of costume and site. In the many historical paintings like this one that she was commissioned to paint, historic accuracy was the hallmark of her style. She maintained a collection of vintage historical clothing and researched her paintings with the scrupulousness of a historian. Her home and studio still stand in Honesdale, and a small but precious collection of her paintings, drawings, and memorabilia are preserved in the Wayne County Historical Society. But Jenny Brownscombe is not merely a famous daughter of northeastern Pennsylvania in Wayne County. She belongs to the larger story where the history of art and women's history intersect. She studied at Cooper Union in New York City, which enrolled women, not many schools did, and at the prestigious National Academy of Design, where she sold her first painting, professionally established, in 1876. Jenny Brownscombe was also one of the founders of the Art Students League in New York City, still exists today, and she even instructed there, which for a woman was a singular prestige. She maintained studios in Rome, London, New York, and Honesdale, and did succeed in making her living as a woman artist. Her work was regularly printed in leading magazines of the day: Harper's Weekly, Scribner's Magazine, and the New York World newspaper described her as one of America's best artists. But it was not a career that was given to Jenny with a silver spoon. Her family was not wealthy and could not afford art supplies for their talented child. Jenny's first drawings were made with berry juice, and she earned the money for art school by teaching in Honesdale for a number of years before leaving for New York. There are a few essays about Jenny in art history journals, and she is routinely mentioned in general surveys of Pennsylvania art and artists, but there's no full-scale study of this regional woman who made her way in a man's world, the man's world of art, in late 19th century New York. Why is this? Although African Americans had settled north in Scranton and Waverly, a stop on the Underground Railroad, the history of women of color in Lackawanna County remains to be written. Foremost among the names of Black women who have contributed their vision, energy, and time in making industrial Scranton a better place to live is Louise Tanner Brown. Her family history is not just the history of Scranton, but it's important to African American history at large. She was the niece of a very, very important author and bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Benjamin Tucker. This made her a cousin of Henry Ossawa Tanner, the first African American artist in American history to achieve international fame in the late 19th century. Louise Tanner Brown was a leader in Scranton's small African American community and was a much sought after speaker on African American poetry. At her husband's death in 1923, Louise assumed full direction of his George Brown Draying Company and soon was recognized for her business acumen. She was recognized by the National Federation of Churches of America, but also by the National Negro Business and Professional Women's Clubs. She founded the Progressive Recreational and Social Services Association and the Community Center for Negroes, thus offering to Blacks the same athletic, social, and educational services provided by the local YWCA. No stone marks her grave in Scranton's Forest Hill Cemetery, where Tanners and Browns are interred, and no local history book yet tells the story of Louise and her generation of African American in Scranton, but there are scholars at work, finally. The history of a women's club movement in Scranton is found in the archives of a women's club that will be 100 years old in 2011, the Century Club. Few people in Scranton or Pennsylvania know the early history of this progressive club that advocated higher salaries for teachers, public health care in schools, child labor reform, juvenile court and prison reform, conservation, pure milk and food laws, and promoted urban planning in the face of the city's rapid industrialization. So much of what this club established has been assumed administratively by city and public service organizations that it's challenging to remember a time when initiatives like garbage removal and public sewage and public health care were primarily women's issues. From the moment the club organized in May 1911, it was a thorn in the side of city government. Their first focus was on the educational system and working conditions for women and girls in local silk factories and lace factories. Two early initiatives by the ladies of the Century Club brought Scranton into the hurl and burl of urban planning and the new sociology. The first initiative was begun by a corps of women who merged to form the Century Club. They called themselves the City Improvement Association, and they were dedicated to the proposition of making Scranton a city beautiful. They were concerned that the accelerating pace of industrialization was destroying the beauty of avenues, parks, and buildings. Under the leadership of Louise Hunt Dimmick, a native of Wayne County, now resident in Scranton, the ladies began to take charge. Dimmick founded Scranton CIA and immediately invited to Scranton one of America's foremost urban designers, John Nolan of Cambridge, Massachusetts. The city plan that Nolan drew up in 1910 for the Century Club became the ladies' game plan. They adhered to his recommendations fiercely, and as a result, were successful in lobbying the mayor to appoint the city's first City Planning Commission in December 1912. 3 months later, the commission recalled Nolan to Scranton to lead the campaign for urban improvement, development, redesign. Also in 1913, get this, the ladies of the City Improvement Association, now having become a department in the Century Club, invited the Russell Sage Foundation to conduct a social survey of Scranton. Although they couldn't afford a full-blown survey that cost $10,000, the women raised enough money to support what was called a Pathfinder survey, a one-week investigation of social conditions in the city. The report supplied by the foundation became, again, the Century Club's working plan, and one of the first problems addressed by the ladies was the chaotic system of charitable service rendered by the city. In 1914, Scranton united all of its charities into one organization, the Associated Charities of Scranton, and Century Club women led the way. In 1916, the club was divided on the pressing issue of preparedness that was electrifying the nation as World War I split Europe apart. A parade was organized to demonstrate readiness to protect the homeland. Women of the Century Club argued whether or not it was really appropriate for them to take part, since they were by mission nonpartisan and peace-supporting. They didn't want to make a political statement. In the end, advocates of participation won out, and the women dressed in white and marched in a parade that included Lackawanna County suffragists and women representing the local Women's Christian Temperance Union. This vintage photograph, which hangs in our office, shows that festive day and the women marching. If not for the Century Club, Scranton would not have had many opportunities to enjoy fine art and music. The club gave the city its first major exhibition of paintings by local artist John Willard Wrought. 64 of Wrought's paintings were exhibited at a time when the Everhart Museum was serving exclusively as a natural history museum. When the Everhart was founded in 1908, the city had promised to erect 2 more buildings, one for science and one for art, but this never happened. And without an art museum during the early 20th century, works of art in Scranton were exhibited mostly in artist studios and in storefront windows. The Century Clubhouse, with its spacious rooms, provided exhibition space to local artists, to exhibitions that they rented from the American Federation of Arts, and to exhibitions by Scranton's Society of Architects. Directly connected to the Metropolitan Museum through its extension program, Century Club women kept the community abreast of current issues, artists, and ideas in the fine arts. In 2010, the nation will be celebrating the sesquicentennial of the beginning of America's Civil War. We shouldn't forget the women of northeastern Pennsylvania when those celebrations begin. Sarah Walker of Susquehanna County was the driving force behind the Susquehanna County chapter of the United States Sanitary Commission, 1863 to 1865. If it weren't for her friend and historian Emily Blackman of Montrose, Pennsylvania, we would not know as much of her life during this time as we do. Emily Blackman published her History of Susquehanna County in 1873. This partially deaf woman traveled by horse and buggy throughout the county gathering data, interviewing people with the aid of a hearing companion. She traveled as well to Wilkes-Barre and Harrisburg in search of documents. Now, if you study the histories of other northeastern Pennsylvania counties, you will find scant mention of the deeds of women beyond charitable and missionary work. Not so with Emily. She includes in her history an appendix to that history that contains a full account of the wartime activities of the Ladies' Aid Societies and the Sanitary Commission chapter in Susquehanna County. The women supplied extraordinary amounts of food, clothing, bandages, and let it not be forgot, sauerkraut to Union soldiers at war. Prevented scurvy. Sarah Walker organized this production line, traveling personally to each rural chapter to encourage her women and regularly supplying $10 in financial support. What you see on the slide now are objects that were loaned to our exhibition on Northeastern Pennsylvania women. This particular case holds memorabilia belonging to Emily Blackman. The pile of paper you see in the foreground is the full handwritten manuscript for the history of Susquehanna County. And directly behind that, a little bit difficult to see, is her hearing horn that she used as she traveled and took interviews. Let's not forget the Women's Third Army during our Civil War commemorations. It didn't wear blue or gray, it wore crinoline. It fought for years with needles, ink pens, canning kitchens, sewing baskets, seeds, and hoes. When the war ended, Sarah Walker continued her work for abolition by sponsoring a teacher for 2 years in the freedmen's schools of Mississippi. That teacher was Emily Blackman, some of whose memorabilia fortunately remains in the Susquehanna Historical Society. Wayne County poet, this is the portrait that we have of Sarah Walker, which is in Montrose, that you can see. Next. Wayne County poet Harriet Gertrude Hollister Watrous moved to Lackawanna County when she married. She didn't let 6 children stand in the way of her literary career. In 1886, she published a volume of poetry called Cobwebs. Her nom de plume was Stella of Lackawanna. One of her poems was so popular that it was set to music and sung around Union campfires. But Cobwebs also contains this hauntingly beautiful poem of the Civil War era. Bring them home tenderly, poor, breathless clay, yet what brave hopefulness bore them away. Hand to hand clingingly, linked in sweet trust, tenderly, tenderly bear home their dust. No one in Scranton knows, perhaps few in Philadelphia. This is I should say that the edition of Cobwebs, the first edition of Cobwebs that we have in Scranton is found in the Lackawanna Historical Society, and we have also republished a new edition if you're interested in reading more of the poetry of Harriet Gertrude Watrous. Here we go. No one in Scranton knows, perhaps few in Philadelphia even know the name of Emma Garrett. And she's a historical lady shared by both cities. Emma was a graduate of Alexander Graham Bell's Boston School of Vocology and one of his brightest pupils. She was passionate about teaching deaf children to speak. She regularly addressed national and international conferences. She published regularly in the Annals of the Deaf, and she established 2 schools for oral instruction in Pennsylvania, the first in Scranton and the second in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia school was called the Home for Training in Speech for Deaf Children Before They Are of School Age. In 1884, Emma was offered the position of principal at Scranton's Oral School for Deaf Mutes, now the Scranton State School for the Deaf. In the Alexander Graham Bell papers in the Library of Congress, there's a letter from Emma to her teacher mentor asking for his advice as to whether or not she should accept the position in Scranton. His reply doesn't exist, but history demonstrates her answer to Scranton was yes. From 1884 to 1891, Garrett created a curriculum for oral, not sign instruction for children in northeastern Pennsylvania. Believing that oral education should begin before school age and failing to convince the school's board of that, she left Scranton for Philadelphia to found a preschool for deaf children. When Americans traveled to Chicago, this is a view of the very early view of the oral school for the deaf. Today there are a few more buildings, but the building still exists. Unfortunately, the school has also fallen victim to budget cuts, which is again quite tragic, but we have the school still here. When Americans traveled to Chicago in 1893 to see the exhibitions at the Columbian Exposition, they saw Emma Garrett's display in the Children's Pavilion. There she exhibited buildings and curriculum of the Scranton Oral School. In Chicago, while participating in the fair's exposition, she tragically took her life by jumping from her hotel window in 1893. A letter written 15 years later by her sister Mary explains that she did so in despair as a result of all the trouble she was having establishing oral instruction of the deaf in Pennsylvania. But the two schools Emma Garrett established in Scranton and Philadelphia are still with us today, one lingeringly, neither possessing the same name, neither teaching the oral method that she so much approved. But records preserved in the archives of the Scranton State School for the Deaf and Emma Garrett's own published writings are beginning to yield a clearer picture of this committed educator. I'm approaching the end of the lecture, and I have only just begun, but I'd like to mention yet another woman that Scranton and Philadelphia both share. Her name is Susan Evelyn Dickinson. She was a Quaker woman, born in Philadelphia in 1832, sister to a more popular, more well-known sister, Anna. Next. Anna was a staunch advocate of abolition. She was an eloquent orator. She began a career as a lecturer pre-Civil War, and at the height of her popularity as a lecturer, commanded fees only second to those of Ralph Waldo Emerson. She was up there, folks. She counted as personal friends Frederick Douglass, Horace Greeley, Whitelaw Reid, and high-ranking members of the Republican Party. Single-handedly, Anna supported her brother and her sister Susan, who was caretaker to their mother. When Anna fell on hard times, she resided with Susan in Honesdale, and it was from Honesdale that Anna was, at Susan's directive, placed in a mental institution. Anna was outraged and took to court her sister and all who participated in what she believed to be her abduction from Honesdale to the institution. The sensational trial was heard in Lackawanna County, with Susan Dickinson represented by none other than Marjorie Scranton's lawyer father, Judge Everett Warren. In the end, Anna Dickinson won her case, and Susan, now permanently estranged from her sister, remained to live and work in Scranton. In her own right, Susan was a good writer, having many of the same friendships as Anna did with leading thinkers of the day. She directed her pen to journalistic work, a career she had begun in the Civil War when she wrote for the New York Tribune as a war correspondent. Later, she wrote for the New York Daily Graphic as a reporter and devoted 7 years writing in the Philadelphia Press as the correspondent from northeastern Pennsylvania. We can see northeastern Pennsylvania through her eyes. I haven't yet been able to locate all of her writings. I don't know how much I will be able to find, but I would very much like to see northeastern Pennsylvania through her eyes during this remarkable period, 1880 through 1920. While residing in Honesdale, she wrote for the Pittston Gazette. The Wilkes-Barre Record carried her weekly column. She was also an ardent feminist, and when she became woman co-editor of the Scranton Truth newspaper in 1884, she used her pen to promote suffrage and women's club information and initiatives like playgrounds for urban children, labor, reform, and suffrage. At her death, the Scranton Times wrote, "No local woman has done more for the suffrage cause in this state than Miss Dickinson, who named herself a born suffragist." Anna Dickinson's life has been studied in at least 2 biographies, but in both Susan plays a minor role in the forceful drama of her sister's life. I'm thinking that Susan bears more study for the role she played in Progressive-era Scranton and in women's history in northeastern Pennsylvania. I want to tell her story. Maybe someday I will. Now, before we close, you must know that not all northeastern Pennsylvania women were quite as proper as those I have mentioned thus far. And 2 notable women certainly were among those who marched to the beat of a different drum. Let me introduce Belinda Mulrooney of Carbondale, PA. Belinda was born in Ireland, left there with her grandmother by parents seeking opportunity in America. Mr. Mulrooney found employment in the Lackawanna Valley mines, and after a few years, he sent for his daughter, Belinda. Now, Belinda was not at all happy in Carbondale, PA, and as soon as she could leave, she did. She made money by selling coal that had fallen off coal trains, and with a small fortune, she headed west. Her first stop was Chicago in 1892, when the city was immersed in those preparations for the World's Fair of 1893. Belinda set up a sandwich stand on the Midway and made enough money to open a restaurant. With her earnings from the restaurant, she opened a hotel. And by the time the fair ended, she was a wealthy woman and she resumed her journey westward. In San Francisco, she fell in love with a wastrel by the name of Carbonneau, who spent all of her fortune and left her for her sister. Belinda had to start all over again. She took employment on a steamer that traveled between San Francisco and Alaska, and soon discovered the need in Alaska for a good import-export business. So by ship and by dog sled, she managed a business that supplied Alaskans with more of the comforts of home in the wilderness. In this particular image, if you count from the bottom, the foreground gentleman standing there with the sled, she is directly behind him. She is the woman that is Belinda with her crew of import-export personnel. She prospered, and with the money she earned in business, she staked a claim in the Klondike. What do you bet happened? This is a lucky lady. As it happened, she staked one of the richest claims in the region and became an heiress. She founded Dawson City Bank in Alaska and contributed to the early growth of this pioneering town. In this particular image, she is standing at the center in the light-colored dress. They're holding a pan, and she's holding a fairly large nugget of gold in her hand. For herself, she built Carbonneau Castle, known as Carbonneau's Folly, and lived a life of leisure far from the mines of northeastern Pennsylvania. You won't find much mention of Belinda in the annals of local history, since once she left, she never returned. But if you study the pages of women's history in Alaska, you will inevitably find successful, entrepreneurial Belinda Mulrooney of Carbondale, PA. A second extraordinary woman hunted in the forests of Susquehanna and Wayne counties. She was known as the female hunter of Long Eddy, or the female hunter of the Delaware Valley. Her name was Lucy Ann Lobdell, and much of what we know of her is found, believe it or not, in a remarkable self-published autobiography in the collection today of the Wayne County Historical Society. Here's Lucy's story. Lucy was married at an early age and shortly after giving birth to her first child, was abandoned by a ne'er-do-well husband. Faced with the task of supporting her aging parents and young child, she turned to the type of work she liked the best. Not domestic work, hunting. She was quite the marksman. Family life was not her passion. She abandoned child and parents and assumed the identity of a male music teacher. She maintained the role until she became engaged to a young woman and her true gender was exposed. Needless to say, she was driven from town. Lucy resumed a life in the wilderness and one day strolled into Honesdale. She presented a remarkable appearance and was immediately jailed for vagrancy. In jail, it was discovered that she was a woman. So, saddled with the diagnosis of insanity, she was placed in a sanitarium. While there, she met a young woman who had been abandoned by her husband, and together the two women escaped the institution for a life in the wilderness. At this point, Lucy Ann began to call herself Joseph, referred to her companion as her wife, and commenced preaching. She wasn't a good preacher, but it wasn't a lack in theological training or oratorical skill that led to her ministerial downfall. Once again, her true gender was discovered, and she became persona non grata. After living in the wilderness for a while, Lucy Ann and her wife once again made their way to Honesdale. Not surprisingly, they were jailed as vagrants, and in jail it was discovered again that Joseph was Lucy. Back Lucy Ann went to the sanitarium. Lucy Ann's parents were so ashamed of her by now that they sent notice of her death to the New York Times. It was an obituary that she outlived. Her wife tried for years to have her released, but to no avail. Lucy Ann died in 1912 in the sanitarium, where she had been described as, I quote, a clinical curiosity in psychiatric medicine. Is it just a funny story? I don't think so. The autobiography of Lucy Ann Lobdell chronicles the truly extraordinary life of a young woman determined to live life on her own terms, outside prevailing norms for womanhood. It's a proud and actually very dignified biography and well worth the read. Finally, I would like to conclude. This is a photograph of Lucy Ann in her later years. And we're going to conclude now with Cornelia Bryce Pinchot. Was the wife of twice governor of Pennsylvania, Gifford Pinchot. Like Marjorie Scranton, Pinchot deserves a full-scale biography, but this has not happened. Why is this? Surely it could not be because no one has assumed the onerous task of going through 573 boxes of memorabilia that she left to the Library of Congress. I should tell you, on fall break, I just began to go through them. In 3 days, I got through 3.5 boxes. It's going to be a long journey. But what I have found has been incredible. She left radio scripts, speeches, drafts for books, correspondence, scrapbooks, photographs. There's no dearth of material. She was a suffragist, a feminist, a prohibitionist, a clubwoman, the wife of a Pennsylvania governor, daughter of a Democratic congressman from New York, and granddaughter of a New York City mayor. Politics was in her blood. In fact, she said, and I quote, "Politics is the best of all indoor sports." And she was certainly good at the sport. Cornelia was one of 8 women who drove their cars throughout Pennsylvania for suffrage. When the Silk Girls of Allentown struck against low wages and sweatshop conditions, she walked with them. That is her in the sort of brightly flowered dress. When the federal government began to investigate sweatshop conditions in Scranton in the 1930s, she sat on the panel. She was active in the State Federation of Women's Clubs and personally supported many of the initiatives as Pennsylvania's First Lady. Her marriage to the elder Gifford Pinchot was a study in opposites. She was younger, more extroverted, a decidedly flamboyant foil to his dapper elegance. But they rubbed along well. One story relates that during a lively conversation while entertaining visitors, Cornelia, in exasperation, picked up her pat of butter and hurled it across the table towards Gifford. Absolutely nonplussed, he simply raised his bread and caught it. That's a marriage. Now, I am finding in Cornelia Pinchot's papers the story of Pennsylvania suffrage, labor reform. I'm finding bits and pieces of information about her friends and colleagues. I hope I can find information about her friend Marjorie Scranton, for whom I have so few documents. Check in with me in a year, and I may have more to say about Cornelia and Marjorie. But for now, I'm going to let Cornelia have the last word. I think she deserves to have the last word on the remarkable women of northeastern Pennsylvania. What you're going to hear is a sage pronouncement that is borne out so often and so well in the lives of our regional women. Here's Cornelia. My feminism tells me that a woman can bear children, charm her lovers, boss a business, swim the channel, stand at Armageddon, and battle for the Lord, all in a day's work. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak of these great ladies. Any questions? Any great ladies that I need to know about that you want me to research? I've got many of them, yes.
How long did it take you to do all this?
I've been working on this for about 5 years now, and I'm drowning in the material. There's so much between the 5 counties that I'm researching. The Century Club alone has such a remarkable set of records that literally documents the early 20th century history of Scranton, that I could spend the rest of my career just on that. So I feel like I'm skimming more than I want to, but if I would stop and go too deep in one, there's so much else that has to be at least brought forward, I think, so that hopefully I can encourage other people to come in on the project and help research it. It's a topic that I'm truly convinced needs more research. So I welcome anyone here who wants to join me. Yes?
How did you come to this area of research? How did you become interested?
Well, you know, I'm asked that question. I'm not sure I even really know, but at the time that I began to look at the women, just a general subject matter of women in Scranton, I was a part-time curator at the Everhart Museum, and I was studying the work of women artists there. And the question I asked was, well, we did have a couple of women artists here, and they studied abroad at very great places. Why did they come back to Scranton? What was here to support them as an artist? Why did they stay? Because there were so many other places they could be. And that's what led me to ask, what was the art scene like in Scranton? And from the art scene, I went immediately to the women, because it was obvious that the women in the early 20th century were making that art scene, and that's how the whole women issue started. I was discouraged a little bit by colleagues saying this is really not a valid topic, or you aren't going to really find that much, but I have to say that's so totally wrong, really. There's too much material, but I'm hoping that through exhibitions and lectures and more students doing research, more scholars doing research, that before long we'll have a nice, worthy book on women's history in our area, because it definitely merits it. It definitely merits it.
Very interesting.
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you.